I'm Tony Ruiz, contributing editor at Gold Derby, here with Howard Korder and Kirk Ellis, the writers of the Apple TV Plus limited series Franklin, which looks at a very specific time in Benjamin Franklin's life in Paris. And Kirk, I read a quote somewhere that you initially pitched this as kind of like a John Adams meets John le Carré.
That's correct. That's right.
And so, at what point did that? How much of that original pitch made it to the final, and when did it pivot?
Well, the element that espionage element, suspense element, is still pervasive in the show itself, but in the course of many years of development, and the expansion of the original scope of that one-liner, many other things came aboard on this. But also following very much in the spirit of Stacy Schiff's book as well, which incorporated elements of espionage, romance, intrigue, political machination, all of that sort of thing. So it was all deeply embedded into the story. And it was a matter of how that was all going to get teased out over the course of an 8-episode limited series.
And so, Howard, at what point did you come on board?
I came on in March of 2022. And wound up spending the rest of the year in Paris on the production. I guess maybe I was looking at the script a little differently than Kirk, although certainly that John le Carré aspect was very prevalent. The part of it that I really latched onto was that this was a very sophisticated game being played by very clever people, all of whom wanted something from the other person, and all of whom were prepared to say anything and do anything to get it. And it really was a battle of wits. There's a line in really the last 10 minutes of the series where Franklin says to Comte de Vergennes, the foreign minister, he says, "I did not mean to wound you." And Vergennes replies, "You haven't wounded me, you've outsmarted me. That's far worse." And that was kind of my particular yardstick through the show. The stakes were very high, but they were being played in, I hope, a very witty way.
There was a line, you never know what people are going to take from a show, and there was a line in one of the recaps, I think of the finale, it may have been episode 7, but that it was 6 men in a room decide the fate of America. And that was true. That's literally what happened. And the show is about these attempts to outsmart each other, people with different agendas, the fragility of those negotiations, obviously chess is a major metaphor, both visually and in the dialogue of the show, about how fragile America's democracy was, because we were a pawn in a game that was much larger than us. And I think there's that Mark Twain adage about how while history doesn't repeat itself, it very often rhymes. And it was hard, certainly going into the last days the days of production and development, not trying to see the analogy between America at that time and the Ukraine now. This country that nobody cared a fig about, that was up against one of the largest military powers in the world, and could only survive by seeking an alliance, seeking a suitor. And that was very much what America was doing. And Franklin understood that whole strange quest for a democracy to use a monarchy to establish its independence.
To amplify on Kirk's point, I was about to say no one in this story was an idealist, but perhaps Adams was, and I think in his way Franklin was, but they were they were not pursuing a utopian ideal. They were after whatever they could get under the circumstances on all sides. It is, you could argue, a quirk of the centuries-long rivalry between England and France that the United States gained its independence and exists today. It was nothing anyone else cared about. It just happened to suit France's goals to try and thwart England. Um, and what happened after that was just an incidental knock-on effect, which of course played out in ways that no one in that room could have predicted. Of course, within 10 years, we were in a silent war with the First French Republic. I think actually we had repaid our debt to France, but not to the French individuals. Many of them we meet in the show, they never got their money back. We were trading with England at a level that was bigger than it had been during the colonial period. And then, of course, we were at war with them in another 15 years. There was no pure line of idealism running through this.
No.
There's that moment, and I kept having to argue why we should see it. I'm not sure it makes any difference, but when they conclude negotiations, Oswald, the Scottish negotiator, holds up a map and says, "Gentlemen, here is your America," because I wanted people to see basically what we'd gotten, what we'd able to bargain for, which was this land that ended at the Mississippi. I thought people actually needed to physically see what the country was we were talking about, you know. But we wandered off way off the topic of the question.
Well, no, but to me, one of the most powerful lines in the show, and I think it's a through line of the show, because we're talking about these machinations and these negotiations, in that it's really about diplomacy, seeing diplomacy in action, and realizing that the biggest changes in history are not always necessarily through cannons and guns and swords, right, but through language. There's that great scene when the printing press is destroyed, and Franklin puts the pieces in Temple's hands and says, "Do you know what you hold in your hands? Power. Don't forget it."
Right. That was an extremely important theme from the very beginning, and certainly I think I can speak for both of us that was something we really wanted to get across. This is not a show about action. It's not about people on battlefields doing what we see on nightly news. This idea that action speaks louder than words. That's not the case of what happens. Diplomacy is about words speaking louder than action. And there was a general, one of the early chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I can't remember under which recent president, who said, you got to give me more diplomats, otherwise I'm going to need more soldiers. Because what they're inextricably intertwined. And I think that one of the things that I know that I'm proudest of about the show, and certainly what Tim Van Patten did with it, is that this isn't a triumphalist show. I don't think anybody looking at the last episode, the finale, goes, wow, everything's going to be great for everybody. There's a huge personal cost to all of this. And this idea that diplomacy is a seduction, not a siege, really pervades how Franklin approaches this. And I think that's an important thing for people to understand today. It's a talking show, but it's about talk and how talk can change the world.
To Kirk's point, no matter what the conflict is, and no matter how intractable and how long it goes on, if it's going to end, it's going to end with people sitting in a room talking about the terms. There's really no other way. That was that was inescapable. It had to happen, and that's where the map of the world changes, not just in our show, but throughout history. Those are the moments where the new lines are drawn, where new power relationships are forged. I also, couldn't help but think of Ukraine. I guess I feel quite unfortunately that it will be worse if Ukraine loses than it would have been if the United States had lost. it will be worse because the English, for all their desire for retribution, never talked about literally obliterating
Right.
the residents of the United States. But that's not to minimize the stakes. The stakes are very high. Um, we, on a very pragmatic level, we couldn't afford to see all those battles, but on a storytelling level, it actually, I think, would have hindered us to show those battles. I think it would have given a imbalanced idea of what the show was saying was important. Um, that in the end, it had to come down to hard talk in a room, to bargaining.
And I think just to, again, to take up Howard's point, what he said about not going to the battlefield, there are only a handful of things where we touch in, and we generally do that with the character of the Marquis de Lafayette, who we've come to establish in the French section. The whole, it's a chamber piece on an epic scale, where you're dealing with Franklin in a place where he literally has to make it up as he goes along, because there is no instant communication. It's several months by sea. Letters get lost, stolen, read, rewritten, and redelivered. So it's better to experience this from this singular point of view, rather than to keep jumping back and forth between the situation on the ground and what Franklin is reacting to, because he's often ahead of things, and he is unaware of many of the losses that are being suffered in America, and just spins a story. He's inventing America in the eyes of the French of the French upper class.
And there's also there's the other half of our story. It's true that Franklin did his very best to seduce France, and France absolutely seduced Franklin, and that's the more personal side of the series. He really was enamored of France and of the French, and I think if circumstances had been just a little different, he would have stayed. He made no secret of that.
Right.
He was prepared to spend, as he says in the show, the rest of his natural days there. And it's really interesting to me. Franklin is this seminal figure in the founding of the country, and even beyond that, he's this archetypal, probably the first intentionally identifiable American, that is, inventing the idea of what an American was. And a great deal of that was a performance for strategic purposes, but underneath that was a certain truth. But he had barely been in the colonies for close to 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
He spent, correct me if I'm wrong, I would say maybe a total of 2.5, maybe 3 years out of the 30 years, between 29 years, between 1756 and 1785. Right. So he was, carrying this idea or myth of America with him, not just for foreign consumption, but for himself. He had to keep that idea alive in his own head, because he's hardly been there.
Yeah, he spent so much time abroad that when he does come back after his disgrace before Parliament, when he comes back to America, because he has no place to go, for the Second Continental Congress, he's considered immediately suspect. He's considered very close to being a British agent, and has to sort of reestablish his patriotic street cred. And no sooner is Franklin there for barely 2 years than he turns around with the secret commission from Congress and goes right back to Europe. So it really is fascinating. When you go to the State Department diplomatic reception rooms in Washington, D.C., there's the state dining room where you see all of those televised dinners with foreign officials. On the mantelpiece is Franklin's favorite portrait of himself, which is not what you'd think it is. It's not the one of him in the coonskin cap. It's him from his days in England, dressed as a very, very well-to-do British gentleman sitting at a desk with this resplendent jacket and coat. And it surprises people because our image of him is the image he created, but he was such a complex character. There's so many elements to this, and focusing even on the 8 years that he spent in Paris, there's so much stuff you have to throw out the window. You cannot do a full sort of cinema verite version of what Franklin went through. There's characters we don't even meet. There are other people who are completely invented, but I mean, it's those kinds of things you do. But I think that the portrait of Franklin that both the script and certainly Michael Douglas's performance conveys is anything but this sort of avuncular figure that has come down to us much through his own writing. His autobiography has got to be the least revealing memoir ever written by an American, if not by anybody. But that's because he's always hiding behind a mask.
Yes, he was definitely carving his own bust in marble for the book. And right, he had ample reasons. There's a strain that runs through the show of him having a kind of overweening pride, and he is often hoisted on it. And I think that was a genuine part of him, and one can argue deservedly so. He was extraordinarily accomplished. I don't know that he was a genius in the sense of some paradigm shifting creator or thinker. He wasn't Einstein or Michelangelo, but I think he had a really remarkable mind that was able to easily turn to any number of subjects and think, fluidly and deeply about them. So, I mean, you can pick a lot of Franklins, and they're all part of that man, who is, well, I am unwittingly about to quote the show. It's where there's a scene with Beaumarchais, and they're in the theater, and Beaumarchais, you understand. I'm sorry, what is I've forgotten the line, Kirk. It's
Well, so he says, you are, but you can. They're talking in the
yes, you can be.
Royal Theater Versailles. He says,
Yes.
It said here you can be.
Yes, you can
night.
be the lover or the king or the beggar one night, but who are you really? And what Franklin replies is, you are who the role requires you to be. And I think that was kind of our template through the series.
Right man
and
for the right job at the right time.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I feel like that description is perfect for Michael Douglas as Franklin, because on the surface, from a purely visual standpoint, you might not think of it, but the way he does so brilliantly embody all of those different aspects of Franklin.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what was that collaboration like with him?
Michael said something which was true, and it took me a little while to accept it. He could have done the full prosthetics. He could have done and I cast no aspersions by saying it, a sort of Gary Oldman. And he didn't want to do that. And what he said was, either people are going to want to see me in this show, or it's not going to work. And I came to really accept the wisdom of that. You had to. It's Michael's gifts and his charm and his wiliness. I think those are the strengths that he brings to the role. And I think you want to actually see the persona through that, as opposed to a full-on impersonation, which would always be questionable, because in the end, I mean, this is kind of a bottomless pit of authenticity. No one really knows what an American accent in the late 18th century sounded like, nor does anyone know what an English accent sounded like, or a French accent. It could have been anything, the wonderful thing about storytelling, and I'll stop, Kirk, because I know you have your you should definitely weigh in on this. Either you accept the make believe and you want to be taken into the world, or nothing we say or do is ever going to persuade you. Um, I think Michael really carries off the portrait of a charismatic, complicated guy, and I think it works completely on that level.
Yeah, and for me, it's the fact that you've got essentially a historical superstar being played by a modern superstar of film and TV. So there's this whole idea of celebrity and how he carries it, how Franklin carried it, and how Michael carries the celebrity. And it's that scene at very very early in the show when the carriage is rolling through the streets of central Paris and it's being followed by hundreds of people, and there's a claim for him. He's known. You don't need to know the precise backstory. All you need to know is that he is idolized. He was the most famous American. He's now probably the only American anybody in France or England, for that matter, could name. So that Michael brings that to the role, and he does that instinctively with what he's doing. I'll also say this about what he does in the show is that Franklin, as you know from having seen it, suffers considerable ill health, life-threatening health in that. And Michael, to my surprise, for one, really threw himself into that. It's really brave for an actor of his generation to lean in to that infirmity and make it a part of his being as a character. It's also true to who Franklin was at the time. And I think that's really, really remarkable. And I can't tell you the number of people who have emailed me or called me, or I've talked to them either here in Palm Springs or in Santa Fe, who have said, no, I wasn't sure. When you told me originally, or it was announced that Michael was playing Franklin, I didn't get it because it is counterintuitive. And after 2 episodes, they're in.
Yeah, and I want to actually talk about that kind of that sense of reality that just permeates this whole series. And I talked to Tim Van Patten about it, about why it was so important for Paris to really be a character in this show, because I feel like without that environment, without the wigs and the powdered faces to contrast this all of this negotiation, I feel like that's as important as anything else, as any piece of dialogue.
What was Tim's answer?
That he didn't want it. That he basically didn't want this to be, a sound stage, stagey sort of look at history. He wanted it to feel like as contemporary as it could possibly be, because I think the story is contemporary.
And
I don't.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
This certainly could have been done on sound stages. I can't begin to conceive of what it would have cost. We had the incredible luxury of being able to film certainly in Versailles, and in any number of moldering chateaus, and in streets in Paris that we dressed, but not that much. I just don't think we could have come close to replicating that amount of texture and detail. We had 2 standing sets. That's all.
Was it?
We had Virgin's office at Versailles and Franklin's the guest house at
Franklin's lodgings at the
Chamont's estate. But everything else was on location, and I think it just brings an immeasurable reality to the show.
But I think it's also the fact that there was a healthy budget for the show. The extras you see in the theater are real people. They're not, replicated through CGI. Same thing is true of the streets. And that was tapping into that whole French movie culture and the history of recreation that they have. It's already well established. But it's also for us shooting, I think for the actors as well, shooting on real locations, including some of the locations where the action actually occurred in real life, lent I don't know. It's a certain je ne sais quoi to the performance of the scene, and the audience experiences it as well. One thing that you don't know, I may be credited at the end of the finale, for instance, is that when Franklin, Adams, and John Jay signed the Treaty of Paris, that's the actual Treaty of Paris desk on which Benjamin Franklin signed the Treaty of Paris. And you would think, well, why not just change? And the desk is a nothing. It's smaller than the kitchen table that my laptop is sitting on now for this interview, but it has a spirit, it has a presence, and it was felt. And I credit Tim and David Franco, the DP, with just finding all of that richness in those real locations and really wanting to milk everything as much as they could.
Well, gentlemen, congratulations. It's just so I love shows like this. They're right up my alley. And I think it's so contemporary and so necessary to re-examine how, again, you can't have diplomacy without words and the impact of that. Everybody go to goldderby.com, make your predictions for the upcoming award season, and stay tuned for interviews with more contenders throughout the coming weeks. Kirk Ellis, Howard Korder, congratulations. A great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny.